Clinker Factor, the cement industry podcast.
Welcome to the Clinker Factor, a podcast from WCA, which looks at the cement industry's response to climate change around the world and other topics of interest. I'm Ian Riley, CEO of WCA, and your host on the Clinker Factor. So as a change today, we've decided to turn the tables a little and interview the editors of industry magazines who've been interviewing people at their events, especially during the pandemic. And so today I'm talking to Thomas Armstrong, managing editor of International Cement Review. Thomas, maybe we could kick it off by just asking you to give a short introduction to your own background and how you wound up being involved in the cement industry.
Well, thank you for having me in, and it's a pleasure to be here on the podcast. So my background, I've been 15 years or so as the managing editor of International Cement Review magazine, and also director of Cemtech conferences. So we have a very global perspective on the cement industry. We travel, or have travelled, as part of our daily work very intensively, and explore the technologies, the markets, and the shape of the industry and how it's changing. My background before that was in consulting, and before that actually in publishing. So I've had a varied background, but the majority of it involved in the cement industry.
Okay, so if you look back to March last year, so a bit over a year now, what kind of changes has COVID brought to your own business? I remember that in the early stages, we were really scratching our heads about how it was going to affect us, and then I think we've all gradually adapted. And how has it changed your business?
Well, one part of our business, as I said, is conferences, and we just completed our Middle East and Africa Cemtech conference in Dubai. We were aware of the pandemic, but very, very quickly after that, that was in February, and by March, we were in lockdown. And immediately, like everyone, it's quite disorienting. You're trying to work out what to do and what the impact will be, and make assessments on a lack of information. But soon we cancelled all our live events, all our travel. We visit a lot of other conferences, and we travel constantly to other equipment suppliers and cement plants around the world. So that was all shelved, and there was a time when it's quite disconcerting, but it has been kind of remarkable. From our side, we've moved all of our events online, and that's had other benefits. It's greatly increased the reach. We've had events with over 2,500 people from over 100 countries registering. So that's quite a satisfying and remarkable thing. We've had opportunities that we've taken, but we're like everyone, we're not traveling, and parts of our business are in Aspic at the moment, and we'll see how things move from then. But looking at the cement industry, it was the same thing around the world. An immediate uncertainty. There was closure of plants. We saw some industries pretty much shut down entirely for a period of a month or two, and we're talking April and May. But quite soon there were really encouraging noises, and we saw that actually construction activity could continue in many parts of the world, and cement plants could operate safely. And there was, we can look at China, which bounced back very quickly. January and February was impacted, and by March, April, it was recovering fast, and in the second half of the year, it caught up and exceeded the prior year growth. So there were some countries that were able to control the pandemic, continue construction activity, and volume, certainly in terms of volumes, remain fairly stable. So it was an interesting time.
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at your business model, going forward, if you look at how COVID has changed the way that you want to organize your business model, is that something that is going to see the future looking very different from the past?
It has changed things. Certainly, live events will change, and I think it will be interesting to see how quickly they can open up again, and the engagement that we receive, and how will people want to travel, how intensely will they want to travel and be engaged in that way. But we have another option now, which is online. So you can move between the two formats. In terms of our own, publication of International Cement Review, we continued uninterrupted throughout the whole of the pandemic. We published every single issue, and for us, that we're very proud of that. It was quite unique in the industry, and we've always had a digital presence. So in that way, if we couldn't send out if someone couldn't receive a hard copy, they could certainly read what we're putting out on the internet. So there are so many opportunities with the digital world that you can continue to operate. But I think there's been a real hunger for information, as certainly in March and April, May, people wanted to know what was going on, and they wanted to hear what other people were experiencing. And that we actually felt that we were really coming into our own, being able to spread that information, reliable, well-sourced information and other experiences that people could understand what was happening around them. And that must be our key function.
I think the points that you make there are very interesting, because one of the things that's clear is that during the pandemic, we've seen a very rapid adoption of technology. So it's not so much that the technology is new. The technology in many cases has been around for many years, but whether we talk about Zoom calls or when you look into the plants, the use of various Industry 4.0 technologies, remote support, remote commissioning, use of BIM for new projects and so on, we can find a lot of examples of technologies that have been, let's say, thought about for a long time, but not really used very much, suddenly becoming very essential to continuing business. And then I think with BIM and remote support in particular, the people that I've talked to that have used them in their own work and their own projects have been delighted with it. I mean, they said, this is the best project we've done. It ran the smoothest, it commissioned the quickest, and all the rest of it. So I think that there's a lot of things that won't go back to the way they were before, now that we've learned actually these new technologies are really good, really work. And we'll see a lot of opportunities for new business models. So in the cement industry, I think in materials industries, generally mining and so forth, you're a little bit tied to getting the rock out of the ground and processing it. But in your business, of course, you have a great deal more freedom to restructure it and take advantage of these new technologies. So I think it must be a fascinating time.
It's a transformation, and we're still producing our hard copy magazine monthly from our home offices. We're all working remotely. It's an interesting thing. I've spoken to lots of people about how they find that, and I think maybe this working from home might be overstated. I think we can do it. That's great, and there will be more working from home and more flexibility in the workforce. But at the same time, people want human interaction. I think things will improve. I think we'll have the options, and we'll have a greater variety and flexibility, and that will be a good thing in the long run.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. Can we go back to business travel? Because I think this is a fascinating area. With the use of Zoom, we've all got used to Zoom, and I think we're getting better at using Zoom. We're learning how to work with it more effectively. But clearly there are some things that are better done in person. And I felt early on in the pandemic that one of the things that was not going to be too heavily impacted was conferences. Because people go to conferences primarily for the networking. Of course, you have to have good speakers and all the rest of it, but I don't think that's really the sort of main reason that people go there. I think they go because of the people they meet there. And I thought, well, you can't really duplicate that online. But I see with some of the way that that's developed, there is more of a duplication of networking events and the chance of having individual meetings with people online. I wondered how you saw that in the future.
Oh, I definitely think it'll be a mixture. I think people will want to reduce travel that's not essential. And I think people who travel heavily will have the scope not to, and that will be a quality of life enhancement. I think the online platforms are great for transfer of information, and sometimes they're even better. You can really convey a great presentation, great explanation of a technology, or discuss topics really well online, but you don't have that human factor. You don't have the interaction and the relationship building. So it's great for continuing relationships. It's not so good for starting them. So we'll go forward, I think, with a mixture, and it'll be interesting to see in 3-5 years where this is. Is there an edge to personal meetings? In which case that will happen more. If people find that actually they can't make the deals that they need to, or understand the information that they want to get from being in a conference, for example, it'll be interesting. And I really think it will be a mixture of the two. And I think it may start slowly. I think people will also be fearful or concerned of jeopardizing their health, perhaps, from travel, or, a cement plant, does it want to send people around the world to a conference? If that increases the risk of getting COVID, which may not be totally conquered in the next year or two still. So there might be a kind of reticence to travel. In the longer term, I think we're going to use everything.
Do you think that the pandemic has led to a larger conversation within the industry worldwide? Are more people engaged with the industry in different countries, not just their own? Do you think that's been one of the impacts?
I think the impact of COVID, we've shared an experience, a global experience, and it's highlighted human vulnerability, fragility, the nature of global challenges. And then that's a very, very easy way to translate that into other concerns that we have on climate change. And I think, we really globally understand that we have challenges that need to be fought together. It's been amazing that, if anything, it's increased the kind of momentum to deal with some of our global challenges, such as climate change. And last year was a flurry of activity. We get more data regarding the threat of climate change and more commitment to tackle it, both at a governmental level, and then that feeds directly down into industry, and also the push from society, which now demands that kind of change. So COVID has really had an interesting effect on that discussion.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point, and one that people started talking about relatively early on, but I think we've absolutely seen that in the last 6 months or so in particular, an increasing number of companies making commitments. Now, albeit a lot of those have been 2050 commitments rather than something earlier, but I think with the changes in US policy on this, one of the things that seems to be happening in the recent weeks is that more people are talking about short-term targets as well, 2025 or 2030 targets, rather than just having net zero in 2050, which is, maybe less of a call to action than something you have to do in 5 years' time. So I do think that COVID has played its part. And I think also last year, we saw that during COVID, CO2 emissions dropped, but then December on a year-on-year basis was actually higher than.
We're now at pre-crisis levels again. So there was a drop. I think was it around 7% that emissions fell last year, but they've come back with a vengeance as we reopen the economy. So we know that the challenge is still there.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I think on that note, we should probably wrap it up. Thomas, it's been a pleasure to speak to you today, and I look forward to your next event.
Thank you very much, Ian.
My next guest recently interviewed me about AFR, so I'm happy today to have the chance to interview him. Peter Edwards works as the Global Cement Magazine editor and has a PhD in supramolecular chemistry. So Peter, good to have a chance to have a chat with you this afternoon.
Likewise.
And I'd like to ask you a little bit about what you've seen in terms of the changes that COVID has brought both to the industry and to your business. So maybe we could start by looking out into the industry, and I could ask what changes you've seen in the cement industry over the last year or so.
There's definitely been, since the onset of the pandemic, an upsurge in the amount of content that we're publishing regarding sustainability, particularly regarding climate change. Every week.
And do you think, Peter, that that's happened in the last 6 months, in particular on sustainability?
I think that has happened over the last 12 months, but there's also a new wind and solar power contract every week or so, or every couple of weeks. Somebody has contracted out renewable supply X for grinding at a particular facility. Some grinding facilities are 100% sustainable energy now. So there's that kind of thing. There's also the low CO2 products, which seem to have really taken off this year. People are publishing press releases about the expansion of things like EcoPact and Virtua concretes. There's been a three-pronged sort of change to the sector. One being acceptance that sustainability is really happening. We've got to do it now with the commitments that have been made to 2050 or plus or minus a few years, renewable energy and product mix.
So most of the targets that have been set within the cement industry are probably 2050. A few companies have set earlier targets than that.
Lafarge Holcim is one of the candidates for a net magical reduction to zero by 2050. But Heidelberg Cement has got a 2025 commitment to 525 kilos of CO2 per tonne by 2025. So that's a shorter term, possibly more attainable target. Downey is another one that's really interesting. They committed 2 years ago, beginning of 2019, to net negative by 2040, which is obviously before COVID. So there's nothing to do with COVID prompting that call. And Cemex 30% down by 2030, in line with the IEA's 2-degree scenario. So and obviously China by 2060. I think the smaller the producer, actually, the shorter term mindset there is. And I think that the associations seem to have the longest term mindset, and kind of relying on work below to generate the savings that are needed.
The difficulty that both WCA and GCCA have, of course, is that we have to get our members to agree. You have there's a difficulty, of course, in getting everybody on the same page. But the conversations that we've had have been about what do we do to set challenging targets in a time frame that is relevant to today's activities. So 2050 targets are not really impacting today's activities.
No, they're not, and they haven't done for quite some time as well.
Absolutely,
because we could have had this conversation 10 years ago quite easily. The thing, it's like running a marathon, and you've never run before, and it sounds like a great idea, and it's a year away, so you've got loads of time to practice. But you can't just sit around and wish that you can run a marathon in 12 months' time. Yeah, you've got to make a step today to improve the chances of hitting your more ambitious targets later on.
Let's come back a little bit to the impact that we've seen during COVID. So one of the impacts was, as you said, that we've seen a lot of sustainability commitments come out during COVID. Perhaps COVID has had an impact, but perhaps it's just a function of the timing. What else? Anything else that you've observed from your perspective as having changed?
So yeah, away from sustainability, I've asked this question a lot. What's changed in your business as a cement producer, as a supplier to that industry? And there's answers on different levels. Obviously, the first level is we had to shut production and we do social distancing. Now, great for the cement industry. That's quite straightforward. Most of these places are outside of lots of space and not so many people. So it's not like some other sectors that are worse affected. Secondly, there's like the logistical challenge of continuing projects and actually having people on site to do shipping and moving things and trying to commission stuff without people there. And that's something that's really taken off, is the ability to commission a project without the expert from supplier X actually being on site. So that's something that I think, whilst a lot of people want to have their hand held while they're doing installation of the equipment, it's not actually necessary in this day and age. And there's all kinds of wonderful solutions that we've tried to cover, a few of them that are coming out that enable sort of smart networking between the two sites, or augmented reality even. So there's definitely elements of the pandemic world that I think will stick around in that. The first two things, sort of like the handling it on site and the sort of the working remotely with sort of like suppliers and producers together, those things are both reversible. We could go back to a situation where we did not do this. And what I think will be less reversible is sort of an attitude change. Lots of the people higher up in the businesses that previously flew everywhere and had meetings upon travel and hotel in different cities all the time have been forced to stop. And it's made, certainly in the producers, the suppliers we speak to, more aware of the bigger picture. There's no picture bigger than sustainability, which is possibly why we're seeing an upsurge in sustainability PR and commitments and technologies being announced. Separately, We've had contacts who say, I really like Zoom because I see inside the world of the people I'm doing business with.
I don't see business travel going back to the way it was before. I think it's clear that a lot of things that we were doing, we don't need to travel for. But we're also clear, I think, after a year of using Zoom, we're also clear the things that we probably should travel for. So I think business travel will recover, but it won't recover to the same level. I wonder how you see conferencing in the future.
Well, there's two sides to this coin. Obviously, Global Cement, PRO Global Media, is a conference organizer as well as a magazine producer, and that business line has been disrupted massively by the pandemic. That said, our online events have taken off in a way that I think we were really, really surprised by. The directors, Rob McCaffrey and Paul Brown, have put together a schedule of 15 or 16 events this year, all of which can be done from the comfort of their own living rooms, with plans to extend into next year. And this is part of the future. It's not hopefully all of the future, but it's taking the worst bits of a conference away, maybe the travel and the jet lag and the expense, but also bringing you the information that's needed. Real world events, we intend to run real world events again in the future. That is a excellent platform to meet people, and it's an important part of our business. And the only question is timing. Circumstances may change again, and we don't know what the future holds. We hope it holds a hybrid of online and real world events.
Seems likely, doesn't it, that it will be a mix of both.
Just a point on larger event. We organise events for 100 to maybe 400 people. Those are things you can count the delegates and you can see where they've come from and what COVID pass they might have in the future, or what certificates they've got when they arrive at your event. There are mega exhibitions out there of 10, 15, 100,000 people like Bauma or Powtech. You're probably going to need to do test events like they've been doing with music or football or other sports before you can sensibly plan one of those anytime soon. That said, there were 80,000 visitors to Bauma, China last year in November. So it can be done, and that's a sign of hope that some kind of normality is around the corner.
It's interesting to see how the pandemic forced changes upon us, and which of those is likely to be sustained in the future, and which of them will come back from. So with the magazine, the openness that people have had to meeting and to talking, do you see that as being an ongoing phenomenon, or once the other opportunities open up, is it going to revert to that?
I'd like to speak to people at events in a more open way than we used to. There was always a certain awe over certain delegates at events where we wouldn't really want to approach them too easily. But sort of the internet sort of acts as a leveler, I think, and it makes people more accessible. And I'd like to think that would be something that was realised collectively within the industry going forward. Whether it will or not will depend on the individual. But I think that philosophy on this is that openness is good for your business. Telling the story of how those mistakes have been corrected into something better, or a learning experience, or how it resulted in a novel solution, people can be very guarded. And I think the internet's taken the guard down a little bit, and I don't want it to go back up.
I think I've seen a related trend, which is that people seem a little more willing to collaborate across countries, across companies. And maybe that's COVID. Maybe it's also the fact that none of us really know how to achieve this net zero in the industry. And so everybody is very keen to learn until we're on top of the net zero challenge, which is not going to be in the next few years. There will still be that pressure on us to keep figuring out a better way of doing it. And you can see there's so many different solutions. We're not going to have a magic bullet. It's going to be dozens of solutions, some of which work here, some of which work there. And I think we'll move away from this homogenous industry. And
how do you do that? You need partners. You need a dozen partners to start one of these things, and you need 30 to finish it. I mean, I think there may be an openness in the cement sector because every plant is a little bit different, and so there's not so much risk of losing out if you tell something about your plant. It's not going to give them a competitive advantage, and even if it did, they're not in the same market.
And it is different in different parts of the world as well. So you see a huge amount of collaboration in China, where the Cement Association encourages collaboration that wouldn't be considered, normal in other parts of the world. But I do think that the cross-border, the interest in cross-border collaboration is probably higher than it was before. I think that sums up the discussion nicely. Thank you, Peter, for joining me on the podcast. My next guest and final guest on the podcast today is David Bizley. He's the editor of World Cement Magazine, and I should just point out for clarity that World Cement Magazine and the World Cement Association are not related. David, lovely to talk to you today, and it's nice to have the opportunity for me to interview you. I'm sure normally you're on the other side of the table interviewing other people, so perhaps we can give the listeners today a little bit different perspective. But perhaps you could kick it off by telling us a little bit about how you got involved with the cement industry.
Well, thank you for having me. It's good to be here. I'm afraid it's not a particularly interesting story. I joined the company I work for, Palladian Publications, in early 2012, and I started out working on an oil and gas magazine, and then over time a position became available on World Cement, and I was poised to take the leap and become the editor of the publication. Through the help of my colleagues and so on, I've taken on the role, and I've started at a really interesting time, really.
So you've been involved for what, a couple of years now?
On cement since April 2019.
So with still fairly fresh eyes, what's been your feeling about the industry? What surprised you about the cement industry as you've got involved?
Well, to start off with, what was very refreshing was to see how sustainability and environmental related topics were treated quite seriously. It wasn't something that was done as an aside. It was very much a focus, and I realized part of that is due to regulations making it that way, but I felt there was a genuine interest from both equipment suppliers and producers at looking at making their operations more efficient and more environmentally friendly.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that. I think it's something the industry has been concerned about for 20 years or more. And it's certainly something that most of us in the industry have been thinking about. Maybe we could have gone faster, but I think there has been progress made. So just in terms of your own business, what's been the effect of COVID on your business? How has it changed your business and the way you see your business going forward?
I think it's like pretty much every industry. Publishing has seen a drive towards the digital side of things. And so we've really seen that over the last year or so, of a drive towards online conferences, webinars. And I think that was a natural evolution of the industry anyway, but I think COVID has really kind of set a fire and pushed people towards making use of these digital solutions more often now.
And just looking forward, you see that remaining part of the offering that you have at World Cement?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. The advantages of things like digital conferences, although they have kind of come into their fruition during the pandemic period, the advantages they offer are pretty significant. So I think you're going to continue to see those once lockdown restrictions have been lifted and so on. I'm hoping for the future we'll see the best of both worlds, where we have the online events that offer the flexibility, the ease of access, and the general kind of broad range of content potentially as well, with the return of the mainstay physical events that were such a big part of not just the cement industry, but really all kind of major sectors.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very interesting point that you make, that some of the things that we've been doing online we'll continue to do online, and we'll find that works better. And we're getting clearer and clearer about what you can't do online, or you can't do online as well as you can in person.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And not all of the conclusions are necessarily what we might have guessed in advance, because of course what's happened in the last year or so is we've seen, if you like, a decade of technology adoption. So I think perhaps we were slow to take up some of these tools, but today we start to see the advantages of them. So yeah, I think it'll be very interesting to see how that pans out. But I'm also interested in your observations about changes that you've seen in the cement industry over the course of the pandemic.
Well, I mean, to echo what you were just saying, really, I think, and it doesn't just apply to cement, is the industries have finally had to grasp the nettle when it comes to making full use of the digital options that have really been there for a while, but they weren't absolutely necessary until halfway through 2020, when it became clear that you're going to have to make use of some of these or your business is not going to be as successful. You know, restrictions imposed by the pandemic on travel, for example, made it impossible for, you know, an engineering team to travel from Germany, for example, to oversee a project in a plant in India. You know, it just wasn't feasible, or at the least it was incredibly difficult. And now, over the last year or so, although these technologies were available, we've seen them really come to the forefront. We've had articles discussing systems that allow for the virtual supervision of projects. You know, a local support team can visit a plant, undertake a project, and by using a connected device, whether that's a phone, tablet, or, you know, even a pair of smart glasses, something like that, they can provide live footage back to their headquarters on the other side of the planet. And it's almost as good as having somebody there in person. The results speak for themselves. These systems work, they save time and money. And I think, similar to how the event sector has changed, you're going to see these technologies continue to be used, because if you can avoid sending somebody on a round the world trip when all you need is an internet connection, that's a huge advantage.
Yeah, and I think that raises questions about how you support your plants. So a lot of cement plants are in remote locations where people don't like to live. So it's normally more expensive to locate people in those locations, especially, you know, people with strong qualifications. And now the possibility of supporting plants, not just in one country, even but over a wide geography, with a single team is much more practical than it was before. Do you see a change in attitudes to sustainability and to climate change? And do you connect that to COVID, or do you think that just happened at the same time?
I think the changes we're seeing towards sustainability are more of a part of an ongoing process. You know, sort of early 2020, when the impact of COVID was going to become clear, the green agenda dropped from the headlines temporarily, because there were much more immediate obstacles that needed resolving first, in order to continue functioning as a business. But I think it's become clear now that those hurdles have been mostly resolved, that the demand for green solutions is as strong as it's ever been, really. You know, after all, despite COVID, environmental regulations are only becoming more and more stringent, particularly in places like Europe. But then even China now has announced its plan for carbon neutrality by 2060. And then you have the Biden administration in the US, which I think is going to, we'll see that push towards the greener side of things as well. And from a kind of a personal day-to-day perspective, pretty much every article we commission at the moment, almost regardless of the actual technical content, seems to tie itself in some way to the idea of promoting a greener cement industry. And that's encouraging to see. And when we held our Envirotech web conference back in April, you could tell from the audience feedback that the demand for information on green technology and green solutions was really high. You know, we had questions on all kinds of potential systems for reducing emissions.
Yeah, I think that the cement industry, because the cement industry has been the source of emissions for a longer period of time, been very aware of these CO2 related issues. When we look at the potential steps we can take that go beyond the traditional, you know, energy efficiency, alternative fuel, clinker factor levers, a lot of those are in concrete or in other building materials, in aggregates, for example.
Yeah.
And so I think that one of the challenges for the industry is to engage the whole supply chain. I wonder if you're also seeing that reflected in the articles that you're publishing or planning to publish.
To an extent, we're very niche in that we look primarily at the technology around producing cement. And so when the kind of broader supply chain things turn up, it's generally talking about how we're seeing a greater demand from customers for these green solutions. There's the argument about building a license to operate, and part of that is ensuring that the industry does what it can to reduce its emissions and reduce its environmental footprint. So we are seeing that to a degree, yeah.
I think the other piece of this puzzle that perhaps fits into this, in terms of where the industry is going, is that in the past we've had pretty standard technologies, regardless of where your geography is. Regardless of where you're going to build a plant, the solution is going to be pretty similar. And in the future, because of the different economics of decarbonisation in different places, that might no longer be the case. So we might start to see a greater diversity of technologies being used. Are you also getting any feel for different types of solutions being considered by different companies or different contributors to your articles?
Oh, I mean, there's a kind of whole spectrum of different solutions that all chip away at the emissions problem. So you have things that can be applied, I think, to most cement plants. Things like waste heat recovery, use of alternative fuels, and then at the higher end you have things like calcined clay operations and things like that. Looking long term, I think the end game solution, if you will, is probably carbon capture and storage and potentially utilization as well. Just because it doesn't just reduce the emissions that are produced, it removes them from the equation, and that's a huge advantage. And if you can also make use of the products you've captured and produce something useful with them, then that's a further advantage on top of it. So yeah, like I said, there's a whole range of technologies that chip away at the problem, and I think we are building towards that hopefully final technology that will come in the form, I think, of something along the lines of carbon capture.
So I wondered if you had anything you'd like to say about career opportunities or something like that. That's a topic that I've heard some people talk about.
In the cement sector, career opportunities, I would say it's not something we cover hugely, but I would say that, and this mirrors something that was talked about quite a lot during my time covering the oil industry, was that when you want to attract younger people, they typically don't want to join industries that are seen as polluting. And that was one of the issues the oil industry faced, and I'm sure that issue mirrors across to the cement sector, particularly when this it seems to vary between 6 and 8% of global CO2 emissions figure is banded about everywhere. I think it needs to be made clear that if you're joining the cement sector today, part of that is going to be making it greener in your job.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, actually. If you wanted to make a contribution to climate change, then if you go and work for a sector that has zero emission, it's quite limited in terms of the contribution you're going to make. If you work for a sector that has a lot of emissions, then you're going to help that sector reduce its emissions and have a substantial contribution.
Exactly. If you go and work at, for a company producing wind turbines, perfectly acceptable career and industry, I'm not in any way knocking it, but the best you're going to do is provide an alternative to a current solution. Whereas if you go and work for an existing industry like cement, you can make an active impact on the problems it faces today.
Yeah, I think we haven't found a viable alternative to concrete
exactly.
as a building material. If you look at the forecast for urbanization, it's clear that the demand for concrete is going to continue, and nobody's really suggested an alternative. There are alternatives for some applications, but not sufficient to make a substantial impact. So I think the challenge is, how do we do it without having the impact? And of course, there is a potential for concrete or heavy building materials, cement, concrete, aggregates, and so on, to become a CO2 sink rather than an emitter of CO2. And I think that's a very exciting opportunity, and one that hopefully will attract a lot of bright engineering graduates to come into the sector and help us solve these problems.
Absolutely, yeah. No, that's a real opportunity, and I think, touching back on that note I mentioned earlier about attracting new people, I think it's really encouraging to see major players commit to sort of significant environmental goals, whether that's equipment suppliers or cement producers. The industry isn't going to progress as quickly as it needs to along this road without the leadership of the major players, and they are thankfully providing it. You have companies like FL Schmidt and their Mission Zero scheme, which is looking at operating zero emissions cement plants by 2030. That's a good example. Then you have Lafarge Holcim is also pushing for its first net zero plant by 2030. So yeah, I think this is an encouraging step, and an important one as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we'll see more pressure on companies to make short-term goals. So 2050, getting to net zero by 2050 is all very well, but it's well beyond anybody's planning horizon. So you really need some shorter-term goals to have credibility with the wider public, or wider society, that the industry means business. And I think you can see a trend towards that.
Yeah, I think it goes back to that argument of the license to operate. We talk about how the demand for concrete is only going to grow, but you want people on your side, and you need to show that you are facing up to the problems that the industry has, and you're working actively to solve them. And as I said at the very beginning, one of the most encouraging things that I've seen in the cement industry is how it really is being taken seriously.
Well, good. Well, David, thank you very much for talking to me today. It's been a pleasure. And I look forward to hearing you on the other side of the table next time you're interviewing someone.
Yes, absolutely. I look forward to it as well.